The final hours of Jesus of Nazareth unfolded within a narrow window of time shaped by politics, law, and fear, rather than by ceremony or myth. What occurred between late evening and early morning in Jerusalem was not a slow public process, but a rapid sequence of decisions made under pressure, in darkness, and with limited margin for delay. To understand those hours, it is necessary to step away from later devotional framing and return to the historical environment in which they took place. Jerusalem at Passover was a volatile city. Its population multiplied several times over as pilgrims arrived from Judea, Galilee, and the wider Mediterranean world. Roman authorities reinforced security during the festival because Passover commemorated liberation from foreign domination, a theme that had repeatedly sparked unrest. The prefect responsible for Judea governed with a small military force and relied on cooperation with local elites to prevent disorder. Stability, not justice in the abstract, was the governing priority. Jesus had entered this city publicly only days earlier, attracting attention from crowds and concern from authorities. His activity in the temple precincts placed him directly in the most sensitive political and religious space in the city. The temple was not only a sacred center, but also an economic and administrative institution, overseen by priestly families whose authority depended on Roman tolerance. Any perceived disruption there risked being interpreted as a threat to public order. By the time night fell, the situation had reached a point where delay was considered dangerous. The sources consistently indicate urgency. Arresting Jesus during daylight, in the presence of sympathetic crowds, carried significant risk. Acting after the evening meal, when pilgrims were dispersed and streets were quieter, reduced that risk. The decision to move at night reflects calculation rather than secrecy for its own sake. The location chosen for the arrest was not within the city walls, but in an olive grove across the Kidron Valley. This area, associated with prayer and temporary lodging during festivals, lay outside the immediate jurisdiction of the temple guards, yet close enough to allow rapid transport back into the city. Such a choice suggests prior knowledge of Jesus' movements and habits, likely obtained through internal communication, rather than chance observation. At this stage, no formal Roman charge had been issued. The initial action appears to have been driven by local authorities, who lacked the legal power to carry out capital punishment. This limitation shaped everything that followed. Any resolution would require Roman involvement, but Roman intervention had to be justified in political terms, not theological ones. The hours ahead would be defined by this tension. What followed was not a single trial, but a sequence of examinations, transfers, and strategic reframing of accusations. Each step narrowed the available outcomes. By sunrise, the matter would no longer be in the hands of those who initiated it. These were the last hours before the machinery of Roman justice fully engaged, a brief, compressed interval in which hesitation disappeared and irreversible momentum began. The arrest itself unfolded with efficiency rather than chaos, suggesting coordination rather than improvisation. The sources agree that a group arrived at the grove equipped with weapons and authority, a detail that reflects anticipation of resistance, not necessarily from Jesus himself, but from those around him. Such precautions were standard when detaining figures associated with crowds during volatile periods. The composition of the arresting party is historically significant. Temple-affiliated guards appear to have been present, acting under priestly authorization, while later Roman involvement becomes explicit only after Jesus is transferred into official custody. This sequencing matters. It indicates that the initial detention was framed as an internal matter, one meant to be contained before it could escalate into a public disturbance requiring Roman troops. Ancient arrest procedures did not require warrants in the modern sense. Authority was demonstrated physically and symbolically, through the presence of armed men and recognized officers. The use of a prearranged signal to identify Jesus, mentioned across independent traditions, points to concern about misidentification in low light rather than treachery for its own sake. In a group of Galilean pilgrims, clarity mattered. The response of Jesus during the arrest is reported with notable restraint. There is no attempt to flee, no incitement of followers, and no appeal to the crowd. This absence is historically meaningful. Leaders who intended revolt typically exploited moments of confrontation to rally supporters. Jesus does not. His behavior aligns more closely with someone expecting detention than resisting it. A brief act of violence occurs during the arrest, but it is isolated and immediately halted. This moment, preserved despite its inconvenience to later theological interpretation, reinforces the impression that armed resistance was neither planned nor encouraged. The intervention serves to de-escalate rather than escalate, which would have been critical in preventing Roman intervention at that stage. Once detained, Jesus is moved quickly back toward the city. Speed again suggests calculation. Holding him in the grove overnight would have served no purpose and increased risk. Transporting him immediately placed him within controlled spaces and under the oversight of authorities prepared to act before dawn. Notably absent is any formal charge articulated at the moment of arrest. This silence reflects the reality that the legal framing was still in flux. The detention preceded the accusation. Authorities appear to have acted first to neutralize a perceived threat, and only afterward to determine how that action could be justified within existing legal structures. The arrest, then, was not the climax, but the trigger. It initiated a process whose outcome depended on how effectively Jesus could be redefined, from a religious teacher to a political problem. That transformation would occur not in public squares, but behind closed doors, before daylight returned to Jerusalem. What followed the arrest was not a formal public trial, but a series of nocturnal examinations conducted under constrained legal authority. The setting was private, likely within the residences of senior priestly figures, rather than an official court chamber. This alone signals the unusual nature of the proceedings. Jewish legal tradition, as preserved in later rabbinic sources, expresses deep suspicion toward capital cases conducted at night, particularly during major festivals. The purpose of these initial hearings was not to pronounce a final judgment, but to establish a viable accusation. Temple authorities possessed broad influence over religious matters, yet operated under Roman occupation, which sharply limited their judicial reach. They could investigate, question, and discipline, but execution lay beyond their power. Any outcome they sought would require translation into terms acceptable to Roman law. The questioning appears to have focused on Jesus' teaching, his statements regarding the temple, and his perceived authority. Testimony was solicited, but the accounts indicate inconsistency and failure to establish a clear charge. From a historical perspective, this reflects the difficulty of prosecuting a figure whose activity was largely interpretive and symbolic rather than overtly criminal. Religious dissent alone was insufficient grounds for Roman intervention. At the center of these examinations lies a critical tension: identity versus threat. Claims about divine authority or messianic expectation were common in the period and not inherently actionable. However, when such claims intersected with public influence during Passover, they could be reframed as destabilizing. The effort underway was to determine whether Jesus' words could be presented as more than theological speculation. The high priest's role in this process must be understood within his political position. He served as an intermediary between Roman governance and the local population, responsible for maintaining order. Failure to do so risked removal. His questioning, therefore, was not merely religious inquiry, but damage control, aimed at preventing unrest that could provoke Roman reprisal. A pivotal exchange emerges from these accounts, preserved despite its legal ambiguity. Rather than eliciting corroborated testimony, the proceedings pivot toward Jesus' own statements. This shift suggests procedural strain. When witnesses failed to align, the burden moved towards self-incrimination, a practice viewed with skepticism even in ancient legal thought. By the end of these hearings, no execution order could be issued, but a direction had been set. The matter could not be resolved internally. With dawn approaching, the authorities faced a narrowing set of options. To act decisively, they would need Roman authority, and with it, a charge that spoke the language of imperial control rather than religious dispute. The night hearings ended not with a verdict, but with a decision to transfer responsibility. The fate of Jesus would be decided elsewhere, under a system indifferent to theological nuance and governed by the demands of order. With the arrival of morning, the case was transferred from religious authority to imperial jurisdiction, marking a decisive shift in both tone and substance. Roman administration did not adjudicate theological disagreements. It intervened only when order, taxation, or loyalty to the empire was perceived to be at risk. This transition required a careful reframing of the issue at hand. The Roman prefect presided over Judea with broad judicial power, including the authority to impose capital punishment. His primary responsibility was not moral arbitration, but the prevention of unrest. Festivals were moments of particular anxiety. A single spark could escalate into a riot, and any hint of insurrection was treated with urgency. The prefect's presence in Jerusalem during Passover reflects this reality. When Jesus was brought before Roman authority, the accusations shifted noticeably. Questions of blasphemy or interpretive teaching were no longer foregrounded. Instead, the focus turned to claims of kingship and authority, language that carried unmistakable political implications. In Roman legal thought, asserting oneself as a king without imperial sanction was an act of sedition. This reframing was strategic. It aligned the case with crimes Rome recognized and punished decisively. The charge did not require proof of armed rebellion. It required only the perception of rival authority. In a province shaped by previous uprisings, even symbolic leadership could be deemed dangerous. The Roman interrogation process was direct and pragmatic. Prefects were not bound to lengthy proceedings or formal juries. They questioned, assessed credibility, and rendered decisions based on perceived threat. Within this framework, Jesus' lack of military following worked both for and against him. It weakened the case for immediate rebellion, yet it also underscored the symbolic nature of his influence, an influence that could grow. Ancient sources suggest hesitation at this stage, not born of compassion, but of calculation. Executing a popular figure risked backlash. Releasing one perceived as harmless risked appearing weak. The prefect's dilemma lay in balancing deterrence against provocation. Roman justice functioned as theater as much as law, sending messages through public outcomes. At this point, responsibility was partially deflected. Jurisdictional ambiguity allowed the prefect to explore alternatives that might remove the problem without inciting unrest. Such maneuvering was not unusual in provincial governance, where authority was broad, but political consequences were immediate. The encounter before Roman power thus became less about truth than about risk management. The question was no longer who Jesus was, but what his continued presence represented. The answer to that question would determine how the machinery of empire would proceed. The involvement of Herodian authority reflects the layered governance of first-century Judea, where Roman power coexisted with client rulers whose loyalty was contingent on imperial favor. Referring Jesus to this jurisdiction was not an act of justice, but of administrative maneuvering. It offered a temporary release from direct responsibility, while keeping the case within politically acceptable bounds. Herodian rule functioned as a buffer between Rome and the local population. Its courts had limited power, lacking authority over capital sentences imposed by Rome, yet they carried symbolic weight. Sending Jesus there reframed the encounter once again, not as a matter of imperial security, but as a regional disturbance linked to Galilee, where Jesus' activity had largely originated. The reception was marked by spectacle rather than inquiry. Ancient rulers often treated detained figures as curiosities, especially those surrounded by reputation or rumor. Questioning in this setting appears to have sought display rather than determination. No formal accusation was pursued, and no evidence was advanced that would justify continued detention under Herodian authority. Mockery emerges here not as cruelty alone, but as political signaling. Ridicule neutralized perceived threat by stripping it of seriousness. By treating Jesus as an object of amusement rather than danger, the encounter implicitly dismissed the idea that he posed an immediate challenge to established power. This response allowed Herodian authority to disengage without appearing complicit or alarmist. The return of Jesus to Roman custody underscores the limits of this jurisdiction. No resolution could be reached without imperial consent, and no incentive existed to prolong involvement. Passing the matter back served both political convenience and self-preservation. Responsibility was redirected, not assumed. This episode illuminates a crucial aspect of the final hours: repeated attempts to avoid decisive action without losing control. Each authority recognized the volatility of the moment. Each sought a path that minimized risk. None found one that resolved the underlying tension. By the time Jesus was returned to Roman oversight, options had narrowed further. What had begun as an internal attempt to contain a problem had now circulated through multiple layers of power without resolution. The continued movement itself created momentum. The longer the case remained unresolved, the more dangerous indecision became. The process was no longer about determining guilt, it was about restoring equilibrium, and the remaining tools available to Roman authority were blunt, public, and irreversible. By the time the case returned fully to Roman control, the remaining decisions centered on procedure rather than investigation. Roman law in the provinces allowed wide discretion, but it also followed recognizable patterns intended to reinforce authority. One such pattern was public adjudication. Bringing the matter before a gathered crowd transferred part of the responsibility from the prefect to the collective, while preserving the appearance of order. The practice of releasing a prisoner during the festival, attested in multiple traditions, fits within broader Roman strategies of crowd management. Acts of clemency were not expressions of mercy in the modern sense. They were calculated gestures designed to diffuse tension. Offering a choice allowed Roman authority to appear responsive without relinquishing control. The contrast presented to the crowd was deliberate. On one side stood a figure whose influence was symbolic, rooted in teaching and reputation. On the other stood an individual associated with violent disruption. The decision forced the crowd to articulate publicly which type of threat it perceived as more dangerous. From an administrative perspective, this choice clarified where responsibility would lie. Crowd dynamics in such contexts were volatile and easily influenced. The assembled group did not represent the full spectrum of public opinion, but a subset shaped by proximity, persuasion, and urgency. Vocal leadership within the crowd could rapidly shift outcomes, especially when the decision carried immediate consequences rather than abstract judgment. Once the preference was declared, the prefect's remaining course narrowed sharply. Ignoring the crowd risked unrest. Acquiescing preserved order, even if it conflicted with personal assessment. Roman governance prioritized stability above consistency. In this framework, the decision to proceed with execution was not an acknowledgement of proven guilt, but an assertion of control. The formal sentencing followed established Roman custom. Crucifixion was reserved for those classified as threats to public order, rebels, slaves, and insurgents. Its purpose was deterrence through visibility and suffering. The sentence communicated dominance not only over the condemned, but over the population watching. Before execution, the condemned was subjected to preparatory punishment. This step served multiple functions: punishment in its own right, physical weakening, and psychological intimidation. It was also a public demonstration of Roman power, enacted in spaces designed to be seen. With the sentence pronounced, the process moved beyond debate. What remained were procedures carried out with practiced efficiency. The legal and political mechanisms had reached their conclusion. From this point forward, events unfolded according to Roman custom, not deliberation. The preparatory punishment that followed sentencing was neither incidental nor optional. Roman scourging was a standardized component of capital execution, particularly in cases involving crucifixion. Its purpose extended beyond inflicting pain. It weakened the condemned physically, shortened the duration of execution, and reinforced the absolute authority of Roman justice through visible domination of the body. Archaeological and medical analysis of Roman scourging implements indicates the use of weighted leather thongs capable of causing deep tissue damage. Ancient sources describe outcomes ranging from severe bruising to exposure of muscle. While the canonical texts do not dwell on physical detail, their restraint aligns with broader Greco-Roman literary conventions, rather than with an absence of severity. The silence of description does not imply mildness. This punishment was administered within controlled spaces, likely inside or near the governor's residence. Such locations balanced visibility with containment. The act needed to be witnessed, but not by crowds large enough to become unstable. Roman penal practice was calibrated carefully to maximize deterrence while minimizing disorder. Mockery accompanied the physical punishment, functioning as psychological degradation rather than spontaneous cruelty. Symbolic gestures, clothing, posture, verbal taunts were common tools used to undermine perceived status or authority. In cases involving accusations of kingship, parody served a specific function. It publicly negated the claim and reaffirmed imperial hierarchy. From a historical standpoint, these actions were not aberrations, but routine. Roman soldiers were instruments of policy, not independent agents. Their behavior reflected institutional norms shaped by decades of suppressing dissent across the empire. The message conveyed was unmistakable. Alternative claims to authority would be reduced to spectacle. After scourging, the condemned was presented again, a moment that combined punishment with assessment. This brief interval allowed authorities to determine whether the display had achieved its intended effect: appeasement of the crowd and restoration of order. Such pauses were pragmatic, not compassionate. No reversal followed. The process advanced. Once scourging occurred, execution was virtually assured. Roman procedure rarely inflicted such punishment without completion of the sentence. The body had already been marked as condemned. Preparation then shifted toward public execution. The remaining steps were governed by tradition and logistics rather than debate. The spectacle would move outside administrative spaces and into the open, where its final message would be delivered not through words, but through visibility and endurance. The movement from the place of sentencing to the site of execution was itself a deliberate component of Roman punishment. Executions were not concealed acts carried out beyond public view. They were processions designed to extend the reach of deterrence through the city's arteries. The route was chosen to maximize visibility while maintaining control. Jerusalem's geography shaped this stage. The execution site lay outside the city walls, consistent with Roman practice and Jewish sensibilities regarding ritual space. The path leading there passed through populated areas, ensuring that the spectacle was witnessed by residents and pilgrims alike. Timing mattered. Morning hours allowed crowds to observe without interfering with festival rituals later in the day. Roman custom required the condemned to bear a portion of the execution apparatus. This act was symbolic as much as physical. It signaled submission and inevitability. The practice also identified the condemned publicly, marking them as criminals under Roman law, rather than victims of private grievance. Sources indicate physical collapse along the route, a detail consistent with the effects of scourging, blood loss, and exhaustion. Roman procedure accommodated such occurrences pragmatically. Assistance could be compelled when necessary to ensure completion of the sentence. The objective was not endurance for its own sake, but arrival at the execution site. The presence of military escort served dual purposes. It prevented interference and reinforced authority. Soldiers maintained formation, spacing, and pace, ensuring that the procession remained controlled rather than chaotic. Their discipline transformed what could have become a volatile scene into a managed display. Public reaction along the route was not monolithic. Ancient cities were not unified audiences. Some observers responded with grief or protest, others with indifference, and some with hostility. Roman administration did not seek uniformity of response. It sought compliance. The procession's success was measured by the absence of disruption. Upon reaching the execution area, administrative efficiency resumed. The site itself was likely a known location used repeatedly for such purposes. Familiarity reduced uncertainty and reinforced the message that this was not an exceptional event, but part of an established system of control. By the time the condemned arrived, the narrative had already been set. The journey had transformed a legal decision into a public reality. What remained was the execution itself, conducted according to procedure and witnessed as intended. Part 9. Crucifixion was among the most regulated yet dehumanizing punishments employed by Roman authority. It followed established procedures designed to ensure visibility, endurance, and unmistakable finality. The act was not chaotic violence but an organized process executed with methodical precision. The condemned was affixed to the cross using techniques that varied by region and circumstance, but always with the goal of prolonging life under controlled suffering. The executioners were trained in this practice. Their task was not to hasten death, but to manage it, allowing the body to remain suspended long enough for the intended message to be communicated. Environmental factors played a role. Exposure to sun, wind, and fatigue compounded physical trauma. Death typically resulted from a combination of exhaustion, shock, and impaired breathing, rather than from blood loss alone. Ancient medical analysis aligns with this understanding, offering a physiological explanation consistent with the sparse textual accounts. The execution site functioned as a public forum. Roman authorities allowed observers, but maintained distance and order. The presence of inscriptions identifying the crime was customary, ensuring that the reason for execution was legible and unambiguous. In cases involving political accusations, this labeling reinforced imperial supremacy. Accounts of accompanying phenomena, darkened skies or unusual conditions, appear across traditions, though their interpretation varies. From a historical standpoint, such reports are best understood as literary markers signaling significance rather than as verifiable meteorological events. Their inclusion reflects the impact of the execution on those who recorded it, not a suspension of natural order. Interaction between the condemned and those present was limited. Roman execution was not a dialogue. Any recorded speech would have been brief, fragmented, and shaped by physical distress. The restraint of the sources again reflects convention rather than absence. What mattered was not what was said, but what was displayed. Time passed slowly at the site. Crucifixion was designed to occupy hours, sometimes days. In this case, death occurred within a relatively short period, a fact that later required confirmation by Roman officials. Such verification was standard procedure to prevent premature removal. As the body ceased to respond, the execution reached its administrative conclusion. The sentence had been carried out. What remained was disposal, subject to legal and cultural considerations. The spectacle ended, but its implications would not. The confirmation of death marked the formal end of Roman involvement. Execution was a means, not an end in itself, and once its objective had been achieved, procedure shifted toward closure. Roman officials were responsible for ensuring that death was unmistakable, as failure in this regard undermined the authority the execution was meant to project. Verification was practical, not ceremonial. Disposal of the body followed legal norms shaped by both Roman and local custom. While crucifixion often resulted in prolonged exposure, exceptions were permitted, particularly in provinces where religious law exerted pressure on administrative decisions. Allowing burial before nightfall reduced the risk of unrest and demonstrated pragmatic governance rather than leniency. The removal of the body ended the public spectacle, but it did not resolve the broader consequences. From a historical perspective, the execution eliminated a perceived immediate threat while unintentionally preserving the memory of the act itself. Roman justice was designed to erase challenges through finality. In this case, it achieved physical elimination, but failed to control interpretation. Silence in the sources following death is as revealing as description before it. Administrative records vanish. Roman interest dissipates. What remained was no longer a matter of law or order, but of memory, transmission, and meaning, domains beyond imperial reach. The state had spoken its final word through execution. Early responses to these events did not focus on procedure or legality. They focused on significance. Yet from a historian's standpoint, the most striking feature of the final hours is how ordinary they were within their context. Nothing in the process required exceptional deviation from established systems of control. The machinery functioned as intended. The final hours of Jesus, examined without later theological overlay, reveal a convergence of fear, calculation, and routine governance. Religious authority sought containment. Roman authority sought stability. Both acted according to institutional logic rather than moral clarity. The outcome was decisive, efficient, and irreversible. In the end, the execution closed one sequence of history while opening another. What Roman authority concluded as a resolved security matter became, through transmission and memory, an event that outlived the systems that produced it. The last hours ended in silence, but their impact did not.